this lesson, we're going to take a look at the development of bones. So in bone development, it happens really in two ways. You have the intramembranous bone development, and you've got intracartilaginous bone development. Intramembranous bone development is the one we're going to talk about right now, and it's really about the formation of flat bones. So it's really important when we're talking about the flat bone development, we need to remember where it occurs. So it occurs in places like the skull. It happens in the ribs, and it can also happen in places like the clavicle. And it's really important to understand how this happens, and especially when we're talking about childbirth, because it really helps to form the flat bones in the skull for fontanelles, or fontanelle structure, in that the cranial bones overlap during delivery. And if you understand how these flat bones are formed, it makes a little bit more sense. So in utero, you have these things called mesenchymal cells, and they are, or mesenchymal stem cells, and they're essentially, they haven't really been identified as any type of particular cell, but what they do is they start to clump in the middle of what is supposed to be a future flat bone. And they form this flat, they form this area in the middle, and it's called a primary ossification center. And what happens is some of the mesenchymal stem cells are then transition into osteoblasts, and they start to build new bone on the outside of this unit, and this unit is called an osteoid. Now, it's really, to visualize this a little bit better, I'm going to make it three-dimensional, and imagine that this is a bone. So what happens is these flat bones are also made in sheets. So you have this primary ossification center, and it grows outward towards the edge. And then one sheet gets laid down, and then another sheet gets laid down, and another sheet gets laid down. So think about this as you're seeing how this osteoid forms one of these sheets. But what happens is these osteoblasts continue to grow, continue to grow, continue to grow. And at some point, hey, we need some blood cells. So blood cells come in, and they provide all the nutrition to the osteoid. Any of the osteocytes that get trapped inside, or osteoblasts that get trapped inside this osteoid, and they can't get out, are transition into osteocytes. But eventually, they'll come to this outer edge of whatever model they're creating. So they come to the outer edge, and this is the periosteum. And underneath it, it will form that compact bone, which is what gives it its hardness on the outside. And eventually, once the entire model is formed, then it'll ossify. And like we talked about with the cranial bones during development, they'll make those flat bones, but then you have the suture lines in between. So let's say this is your parietal and this is your occipital, and you have these little these suture lines. Well, they're contained with membrane, and the baby's delivered, they shift, they allow for delivery, and then finally, once the baby's out and the cranium settles, all of those will start to ossify and harden. And it's kind of a similar process. But the thing you need to think about when you're looking at intramembranous bone development is they're formed sheets. They start at a central location called the primary ossification center, and they grow outward, eventually getting blood supply. Any of these cells that get trapped in are osteocytes, and they'll form this the periosteum on the outside, and then it'll harden. So now that we've got a good idea of what happens with intramembranous bone development, let's look at intracartilaginous bone development. So intracartilaginous bone development is really complicated, so stay with me. But the first thing we're going to look at is the long bone development, and in particular with the diaphysis. So this is the shaft of the bone. So this is your epiphysis, but we're going to worry about what happens in the diaphysis. So it starts as hyaline cartilage, and you get essentially a primary ossification center in the middle of the bone. And it starts to grow outward just like this, and it will form the periosteum, and that periosteum grows what's called the bone collar, and it wraps around the entire model. And as it does, it creates these flat plates, and then they start to harden. But then you can't do it without blood vessels. You need some sort of blood supply to bring in calcium and harden. So that's where you're going to get these blood vessels that come into the middle of that primary ossification center. So everything gets hard. The osteoblasts begin to create your spongy bone all throughout everything, but then you need your medullary cavity. You need your place where your bone marrow goes. So that's when your osteoclasts come in, and they're going to come in and carve out this middle part, and they carve out that medullary cavity. So now that we've looked at the diaphysis, now let's look at the epiphysis. So intracartilaginous bone development in the epiphysis is not really any different than the diaphysis, intracartilaginous bone development. The only difference is instead of being a primary ossification center, it's called a secondary ossification center, and it happens here. So at the same time, you've got your, this is your bone, you get your primary ossification center, and that's what's happening there. But then you're going to have these secondary ossification centers that happen in the epiphysis. The process is the same. You get the primary ossification center, you grow your periosteum, everything lays down, and then the only difference is that you don't have the bone marrow cavity. You don't have that extra or the medullary cavity that forms here. It's just that you don't have osteoclasts to break that down. But what's interesting as a result of the intracartilaginous bone development in the epiphysis is that you have a couple of things that happen. You have articular cartilage that's formed, and that's where two bones are going to meet eventually to create a joint. And then you've got this layer of thin convex bone. So you can kind of see this white area here. And then you get this central spongy bone. And then at some point, the epiphysis, has to meet the diaphysis, and it happens along the epiphyseal plate. So this is also known as your growth plate. So let's look at how bone growth actually occurs. We're going to look at this kind of through adolescence, but what we're talking about is the length first of the bone. So you have this bone. You've got your epiphysis here, and you've got your diaphysis here. Remember, you've got your epiphyseal plate. So what happens is you have your medullary cavity here. Well, cartilage cells come in and they start to lay down new bone. And everything's growing that way. But at some point, you need bigger medullary cavity. So your cartilage cells come in and lay down new bone, and they're converted into spongy bone. And then what happens is at some point your osteoclasts come out, and then they actually carve out more. So let's see what that looks like here. So you've got your bone. This is your epiphysis. This is your epiphyseal plate. This is your medullary cavity. Well, you've got all this stuff happening. So now your bone is longer. Your epiphyseal plate is here. You've got all this new tissue. You still got some, but now you've got all this blank space. So what happens is your osteoclast comes in, carves out your new cavity, your bone is now longer. So what happens? So your bone's longer, it also needs to get bigger in circumference, right? So when we talk about circumference, especially in flat bone, what happens is it happens underneath the periosteum. So you have your layer of, so this is your cortical bone, and then this is your periosteum. What happens is it starts to lay down new layer. New layer, new layer, new layer. And this part starts to get thicker because it's actually growing that way. Well, at some point, it's going to expand, and then the osteoclasts need to come in and break down more of that bone tissue to allow for bone marrow cavity formation for that spongy bone to occur as the bone gets larger. Let's take a look at the different types of factors that affect bone growth. First off, you've got thyroxine. Thyroxine is a thyroid hormone, and when you have decreased thyroxine, which is part of your metabolism, you're going to have decreased growth. You have another thing called the somatotrophic hormone, which is produced in the anterior pituitary gland. So if you have oversecretion of somatotrophic hormone, you're going to have this increase in growth. If it's undersecreting, then you're going to have a reduction in growth. Estrogen and testosterone play a big part in bone growth. We're not talking specifically about height. We're talking about bone growth in general. So it does affect, these two things affect closure, and they're related to puberty, which usually ends somewhere between 17 and 19 for females, and males 19 to 21. The big thing that you need to know is that puberty and your secondary sex hormones are going to affect bone growth. The other thing you want to think about is vitamin A deficiency. This reduces the rate of the cartilage cycle, which means that if you have a vitamin A deficiency, you're going to have a decreased length of bone. So what kind of things affect calcification of the bone? Well, you've got two hormones that we're going to look at. First is calcitonin, and that's produced in the thyroid gland. What happens with calcitonin is it inhibits osteoclasts. So it favors the production of new bone because it keeps those osteoclasts from breaking down the bone. Parathormone is produced in the parathyroid gland and it stimulates osteoclasts. So it's basically a production of it. It says, hey, we need more breakdown of bone. What happens is it ends up destroying the inorganic matrix of the bone and removes calcium and phosphate. So sometimes some people with parathyroid issues will also have increased episodes of or increased occurrences of conditions like osteoporosis because that overproduction of that parathormone promotes the removal of calcium because the bones are a reservoir for calcium. That's where they go get it. So let's look at how vitamins affect bone production. So vitamin A, if you ever have an excess of vitamin A, that increases the osteoclastic activity. What that means is you're going to have, so if you have an increase in vitamin A, you're also going to have an increase in bone breakdown. When we look at vitamin C, a deficiency causes an abnormal matrix, and that causes that calcium and phosphate to be decreased. Similar with vitamin D. Vitamin D, what happens is we get vitamin D from our diet, and it goes into the small intestine. And if there is no vitamin D or it's deficient, we can't pull the calcium and therefore send it to the bones like we need to. So a decrease in vitamin D equals a decrease in bone. So let's recap. Intramembranous bone development is formed in sheets. Remember, you have your primary ossification center and it grows outward until the periosteum is formed and then it hardens. With intracartilaginous bone development, it starts centrally at a primary ossification center and grows outward. But this is in the diaphysis. And in the epiphysis, you have your secondary ossification center. The difference between the two is that you're not going to have that carving out of that medullary cavity. In bone growth, there's growth along the epiphyseal plate, and then the medullary cavity expands. So you'll have the length first, and then the osteoclast carve out that medullary cavity. Calcification is influenced by both calcitonin and parathormone. Calcitonin impedes osteoclast, and parathormone promotes osteoclast. And lastly, vitamins are really important. So you've got vitamin A, C, and D, and they all impact bone growth. So that's it for our lesson on bone development. Make sure you check out all the resources attached to this lesson. Now go out and be your best selves today. And as always, happy nursing.